we're going to start out just broad in general, talking about what each organization is doing, and then zoom in, get more specific, and at the end we'll have a question and answer. So please hold your questions for the end, and don't forget them. So we're going to start with you, Shelby, and work our way over to Greg. Just to begin, can we just start generally talking about what each organization is doing to curb human trafficking in Chicago, because it's all on very different levels, very different sectors. So we'll start with you, Shelby.
Okay, well, I'm the Executive Director for the International Organization for Adolescents, and I'll talk a little bit more about our history and how it came about a little bit later. But our approach is to build a collaborative community response. We see human trafficking not just a law enforcement problem, not just a social service problem, and not just a legal problem. It is everyone's problem. And we feel that it's really important as well for the community to be aware of the issue, to know what it looks like, and to know what to do. It is such a hidden crime. So we do a lot, our projects focus basically on creating relationships, building capacity of organizations that are working on the front lines with victims, and also building public awareness of the issue. So I can go through my project portfolio later, but we are not a direct service organization, but we are former direct service providers who have worked with trafficking victims, who saw the bigger systemic problems that were happening around the delivery of services to victims, and we work on those problems on our team. So.
So the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, or CAASE, was founded to fill a very specific need in the anti-trafficking, anti-exploitation field, which is looking at root causes or the demand side of the sex trade. What we know to be true is that if there were not people who were willing to open their wallets to purchase sex, that the sex trade would just disappear, because there'd be no incentive for pimps and traffickers to recruit victims to sell them to customers or johns. And so I developed this organization specifically to look at that demand side. And the four things that we do, the first thing that we did is we did research. There was no research in existence on really men who purchase sex. And so we interviewed 113 men in Chicago who buy sex. And I always joke that you never know how small Chicago is until you interview 113 men who buy sex and then see them all over the city. One is now a dog walker in my neighborhood. But what we learned from that were a couple of things. The first was that most of these men purchased between the ages of 18 and 23. And so we developed the country's first prevention curriculum for high school boys to help young boys navigate the messages they get about how real men are supposed to act sexually, how that leads to sex trade patronage sometimes, and what they can do to be active social change agents. We do a lot of awareness raising activities like this because there's a lot of misconceptions around the sex trade. We offer free legal services to survivors of sexual exploitation in the civil court system. And we have a policy campaign called End Demand Illinois that is really seeking to transform our response as a state to prostitution and trafficking, which I'll talk more about later, I'm sure.
Hi, I'm going to talk about the law enforcement end. We're doing it in a multifaceted approach. We're dealing with it locally, nationally, and recently internationally. So we're doing child sex tourism in the Philippines. So you have U.S. citizens that are traveling overseas to have sex with minors. So that's a big issue that we're seeing. Most people think of human trafficking as overseas. People are being forced overseas, brought into the United States, into our communities, and being forced. The majority of the stuff that we're seeing is I deal with the children's side of the house. We're seeing our individual children are being victimized from the suburbs to the city. Not so much international. The majority of the cases that we're seeing locally, juvenile prostitution is involving our citizens in our communities. So we're trying to get out there and we're trying to educate, like community groups such as yourself, Niagara Foundation. We're going out to the high schools. We're trying to prevent certain things that are occurring. So we're going in those high areas in the city where human trafficking is very prevalent. And we're going and educating them, trying to prevent what's going to happen is that whole cycle of violence. And we'll talk that in a few, I'm sure. And then also is we're looking at the law enforcement perspective, the supply and the demand. We kind of heard about the, we call them Johns, the men or females that are purchasing sex from these juveniles. We're out there trying to get them. And also we're trying to get intelligence. So our first and foremost mission is to rescue and recover juveniles and to go after the commercial sex traffickers, also known as the pimps.
All right, well, I'm going to start with Rachel. You mentioned misconceptions about human trafficking, and then you all can chime in as you see fit. But what are some of the general misconceptions people have? And let's get specific here, because we are talking about humans, we're talking about people. So what do individual cases look like?
Sure. Well, I think, and you definitely started talking about this, we think about trafficking as movement of people. But for someone to be a victim of trafficking, force, fraud, or coercion has to be used against them. So many people who are in the commercial sex trade industry locally are trafficking victims. They've had pimp control, they've been brought into the sex trade on false pretenses, they might have entered what seemed like choice, but they're kept there against their will. And so it's important for us to expand our understanding of who's a victim here. Because I feel like as a culture, we're very comfortable saying, this person's a victim and this person's a criminal, but these are very blurred lines. And the truth is, what somebody experiences who's born in Chicago and prostituted here, and somebody who's brought here from Thailand, the abuse, the harms are the same. The coercion and the tactics are the same. And so I think we need to challenge ourselves to expand our empathetic response to all people who are impacted by the sex trade industry.
And so what would be some common misconceptions people have? I mean, do you think people think it's mostly foreign nationals, or what is it like here in Chicago and internationally? You could probably chime in on that.
I mean, that's definitely one of them. I think most people think these are adults who are entering, where we see that, best research we have in Chicago says like 16 is when people are entering, and it's actually national data would say it's even younger. People think that if it happens away in closed doors, it's safer, but we see high rates of abuse, rape, and assault behind closed doors and on the street. And people often think, well, if it's that bad, somebody would just leave. But because of these trauma bonds that pimps very purposely create, these coercions, this grooming process, because of a lack of services, because we still have a criminal response to those who are in the sex trade, it's very difficult for people to exit.
Shelby, I know you work, your organization's with mostly children, adolescents?
Yes, and we were founded based on, we were founded by a group of public health graduate students. One of them was a Fulbright scholar who went to Latvia to work on public health work. This was the mid-90s, and human trafficking wasn't really being used as a term outside of law enforcement at that point, so it was something relatively new. And she was working with different organizations, and they said, you know what, our big problem is that our kids are going missing. Right. So we have a young person going to Britain to work as an au pair and then not being heard from again, or a young woman going to Milan to model and then coming back and saying that she had to work in a brothel. So for us, we have been sort of working on this issue for quite a while. We also advocate to include under human trafficking, labor trafficking. Both sex and labor trafficking can often overlap. There was a recent case that we were advocating and assisting the victims with called the Campbell case, and it was an individual who was trafficking young women in massage parlors. And there was one instance of sex trafficking, but overlap of both labor and sex. So I always encourage and advocate that when you hear human trafficking, not just to hear sex trafficking, but to also encompass labor trafficking, which can be as equally as traumatizing to its victims.
Does anyone here know the numbers on what labor trafficking would be like here in Chicago?
That is a really hard number to get. I know that there are hundreds of victims that have gone through the National Immigrant Justice Center. They work with both sex trafficking and labor trafficking. Nobody is counting those numbers. We have better data for the sex trafficking because for most people that seems the most heinous, right? And that's absolutely true. But the labor trafficking kind of gets mixed up with the illegal immigration issue. You can still be smuggled into the country. You can migrate illegally and work illegally and still be a victim of human trafficking because nobody can consent to being a slave, right? So.
Well, you said that the language around it has evolved recently with law enforcement. So, Gregory, could you talk a little bit about how addressing this problem has changed with law enforcement over the years, and maybe if you've seen any improvement?
Yeah. Well, our biggest uphill battle right now is society. That's our big issue right now. If you look at the days of historically, there's, for example, there's 5 areas in the city of Chicago where males, females walk up and down the street, and it's commonly referred to as the track. So it's an area, 5 different locations in the city of Chicago. These males and females walk up and down the street and they solicit jobs for business. Now with the advent of the internet, it's much easier. Individuals now could download an app, they go on the internet and say, I'm interested in a boy or a girl, and they get delivered right to their residence or a hotel room if they're a businessman that's traveling. But society, cultural issues is the big issue that we're seeing. Chicago's ground zero for the celebrity pimp. I'm not going to name names, but they're out here in the city of Chicago. They've been, ever since I was a police officer, way back, in the 90s, early 90s, they're out there on the streets. There's been several documentaries that have been made that glorify the lifestyle. Now, these celebrity pimps hooked up with people, individuals in Hollywood. And you can see it in rap videos. A lot of rap videos talk about prostitution, how glamorous it is. And you just have to look to Halloween. You look at our young individuals growing up right now. When Halloween comes around, what do most guys dress up as? One of the top 10 costumes. They want to be a pimp, right? And what does the girls want to dress up as? Right? Prostitutes, or as they call it, the subculture, they want to be hoes, right? That's what they're calling them in the subculture. So you got rap videos, you got the whole cultural change. So now when you get a very impressionable child, and you get an individual, a commercial sex trafficker, this pimp, who's very highly manipulative. He's very good at what he does. When he grabs these impressionable kids, they're thinking, oh, that's the glamorous lifestyle life. They look, there's money involved, there's flashy cars. I want to be part of that lifestyle. So that's the heart of the uphill battle we're dealing with, because it's not that glamorous life. The statistics they're saying, we're seeing here in the city of Chicago, our children are being victimized as young as 12 years old. That's the national averages. We're seeing what the national average is between 12 and 13 years old. Children are first getting involved in prostitution. And it's not by choice. It's by force.
I was going to say, and just to tag on to that and to address the issue of a shift in thinking. So there is a piece of legislation called the Illinois Safe Children's Act, and CAASE had helped launch this piece of legislation. We have been contracted to help implement it. And what this does is basically decriminalize juvenile prostitution. Right? So there's no longer the term juvenile prostitute in the criminal code. So anyone under the age of 18, there doesn't need to be force, fraud, or coercion present, as it states in other trafficking pieces of legislation. They are under 18. So we have statutory rape laws that say that a child can't consent to have sex. But most of the country, and before 2010, Illinois said that someone under 18 could consent to selling sex. That doesn't make sense, right? So there's a shift in thinking, and I work with a lot of child protection specialists, and even them see these kids as bad. Right? These are the kids we don't work with. These are the runaways. These are the kids that don't really, that will not respond to services, right? I've had a child protection specialist tell me, well, with this law, how am I going to tell the difference between a child who is trafficked and a child who's just a prostitute? Right? And this is a professional. So there's a lot of work to do on shifting the thinking that these kids are minors, right? They do not have the ability to consent to sell sex to somebody. So it's a lot of work to be done, because even people who work with kids really don't have the shift in mindset quite yet.
Well, on top of that, what other changes to the legislation has been made? I guess criminalizing the prostitutes themselves versus those purchasing. Has it changed, or is there more changes you'd like to see?
Yes and yes.
Oh,
so in 2009, we launched a campaign called End Demand Illinois with a very ambitious goal, which was to really transform how we deal with this issue. And the campaign strives to stop the arrest and rearrest of prostituted people and to create tools for law enforcement to go after these pimps and the customers or johns and traffickers. Since we launched the campaign, in the first 3 years of the campaign, we've passed 3 laws, which we think is kind of phenomenal in our legislature. The first was the Illinois Safe Children Act that Shelby just told you about. And not only did it decriminalize youth in the sex trade, it raised criminal penalties for people who are purchasing. So how do we know that's impactful? One of our projects is to monitor a terrible website called the USA Sex Guide. And this is an online social networking forum that men who buy sex use to communicate to each other. So they'll say things like, hey, coming in from Memphis, I like young Russian girls, where can I go in Chicago? And people will have dialogue. Or, hey guys, Manheim Road, law enforcement's out there today, be careful. Right? And so when we monitor, what we saw is when the Illinois Safe Children Act got passed and law enforcement started focusing more on johns, men on the website said, I've been doing this for 20 years, I was just arrested for the first time, I'm out. I'm not a hobbyist. They call themselves hobbyists. I'm not a hobbyist anymore. So we see that changing laws shifts what happens. The second law that we passed, because you asked about misconceptions, and there's this misunderstanding about trafficking victims versus people in prostitution. So many people who were pimp controlled were arrested and convicted over and over again for being in prostitution. And so they have these rap sheets that are pages long, and if you have a felony on your record, we all know how hard it is to rebuild your life. So we passed a law that is called the Justice for Victims of Sex Trafficking Crime Act, which said if you were convicted of prostitution but can prove you were a trafficking victim, you can have the court vacate those convictions. And the first cases are being brought right now. Last year, we expanded the trafficking code because in Illinois, there was too much focus on traffickers using force. But traffickers are business people, right? Using force is not as advantageous as using coercion and these schemes and manipulations. So we expanded that. And this year, we are hoping to pass this piece of legislation to defelonize the selling of sex in Illinois. We are one of 8 states that give people in the sex trade felonies, which destroys their lives. So it's voted on the Senate today, and we are really hopeful. So if you're excited about legislation and you want to make a change, go to End Demand Illinois, sign up for our action alerts, and you can really help continue to make Illinois one of the most progressive states in the country legislatively on this issue.
Excellent. Can you give me a clear idea of maybe what the market looks like here in Chicago? You said all the way from the suburbs to the urban areas. That's sometimes mind-blowing for people to hear about. So maybe a clear idea of what it's like here in Chicago, and what tactic has been the most successful in curbing it? Has it been educating the youth or just law enforcement?
I'll take that first. It's a complicated process. I think right now it's more awareness. I think the advent of the internet, now more people know what child prostitution is. They know there's victims out there. It's not somebody who wants to be in that business. It's somebody who's forced to be in that business because of cultural, economical situations, because of mental health issues. We see a lot of victims are bipolar. There's a variety of medical reasons why sometimes they're that impressionable. So when an individual who targets a certain type of victim, they know what they're dealing with. So it's kind of a hard question. I mean, where are we at? It's out there. It's a big issue. We see spikes when there's conventions in town. We have some of the largest conventions of anywhere else at McCormick Place, and we see a spike of ads, if you will, on the internet. That's primarily what we're seeing now is the businessman that's taking advantage of these victims. But it's not just the businessman that's out there. You have all people from all types, walks of life, and it's very interesting just to deal with some of the individuals that come out and seek these individuals. Rich, poor, all races and classes. It's really interesting out there. But some of the issues that we do see is Chicago's such a big market, so it's a supply and demand. The biggest area we see issues is the city of Chicago. I'd say second of that is the southern suburbs, then some of the western suburbs. Now we do have some cities and towns, they say have a big prostitution problem. But what's happening is what I've seen, it's a self-created problem, self-created crime problem. What does that mean? So you have police officers who are trying to do the right thing, go undercover, and you pick a small town, around in Illinois, they would go onto certain websites and they would order up victims. And it's just that easy. You go onto the adult websites. So everybody's familiar with the Craigslist before they stop posting those adult ads. So if you go onto one of those social network sites and say, okay, I want an individual to come and give me a massage out in my little small town, these individuals show up and I arrest them. If I make 20 arrests, do I have a prostitution problem in my community? To me, it's a self-created crime problem. It's not like the city of Chicago. You have, like I said, certain areas where you have victims walking up and down the street. To me, that's an area where there's a big problem. In the suburbs, there's only one suburb that has that, and she alluded to that location. I'm not going to give out locations, but it's right outside O'Hare Airport. But it's right outside O'Hare Airport, and that's been for many, many years. That's the only other suburban location where you have it victims walking up and down the street soliciting for customers. Everything else is kind of underground on the internet.
And just to build on that, what we have from research is that most of it is underground on the internet. So I think as a population, it's easy to say, not in my neighborhood, not my problem. But most of this abuse and exploitation is happening behind closed doors. So it's important to remember that this is not something we're seeing. It's advantageous for criminals and traffickers to not have their victims visible, because then it's possible for law enforcement to more easily identify them. So this is in all our communities. And as Shelby said, this is all of our challenge and our rights and our obligation.
And just to bring attention to a project we're working on, we have a lot of different ethnic communities throughout Chicago. That's what makes Chicago absolutely wonderful. But these are often linguistically isolated communities. We have just a slew of languages and people who have been born here, who are immigrating here, and it's really a very vulnerable place to be if you're a person new to this country. We have a project called the Asian American Trafficking Outreach Project, or ATOP. And what we're doing is going to South Asian communities, Cambodian communities, Vietnamese communities, where people are telling us that there is trafficking going on in restaurants. We know that there's forced prostitution on Devon Street. And often there are high-level individuals who are actually taking part in the trafficking, whether it's a business owner who owns a restaurant, or somebody who is, serving as sort of a pimp or escort manager. So these are communities where we have a little bit of information. And when I worked directly with victims, particularly those from these communities, they said, there's 20 more like me. And just by luck, they happen to be identified and were able to get out. But I think there's, I think the environment and how pervasive it is and where these markets are for both labor and sex trafficking, we're just getting the tip of the iceberg on what this looks like. And so it's so great to have all these organizations working on this and pulling the data together so that we have a better understanding of where this is all happening.
Thanks, Shelby. Well, I read from the State Department that they estimate between 15,000 and 18,000 foreign individuals are trafficked into the U.S. 80% are women and children. That's a lot of people. How can you tackle that as an organization? What are you doing?
Well, we're not working with all 15,000.
Yeah.
So, these are numbers that sort of reflect who is reaching out for immigration relief. So I would actually say those numbers are low, okay? Because the majority of people are not finding legal, appropriate legal services to tell them that, there are visas, there are ways to remain in the country, not be deported if you are identified as a victim of human trafficking. So I think those numbers are particularly low. I think like domestic violence in the 80s, human trafficking, in the last decade has gained more attention, more awareness. There are more organizations working on it. So I think that there are more outlets for victims to find assistance. We're really good at identifying victims. I think we're getting better at preventing victims. Response and getting the services, the culturally appropriate services that are needed are a little bit more of a challenge. And I think, I'm hoping that's where we see investment, is in getting trauma-informed services. And these victims come out of these situations with nothing. They've often been just taken out of a raid, if there's a raid on a brothel, and they only have the clothes on their back. They don't have their identification documents. And they need to learn English. They need to have job training. They might have an interruption in their education. So we're talking about a comprehensive service need. CAASE, do you want to talk about that program, the project you did, the report on the service, coming up with a service model?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things we wanted to look at is if there's an estimate that on any given day in Chicago, up to 24,000 women and children are impacted by the sex trade industry. For that 24,000 individuals, there are 8 beds that are designated for prostituted individuals in Chicago, and that's children only. That's through the Salvation Army. So we have a big issue, and when people in the sex trade are ready to leave, feel safe, and they start to try to access social services, usually what happens is someone says, great, you're dealing with a substance addiction, go here, and here you can go for your mental health care, and here you can go for your job training, and here you can go for this thing, and all of a sudden you're spending all your time on CTA going all over Chicago, and you say, it's too hard. I'm going back to life, this is too hard. And also not all of these people are necessarily trained in trauma-informed services or empathetic to what you've been through. I wish I could say as a social worker, every social worker is kind and doesn't victim blame. It's not true. And it's not the experience that prostitute people have. So we started to study in the country what were the best programs that offered comprehensive services in a one-stop location, where you would go to this place and you would have a mentor who was a survivor, and you would have childcare, and you would have self-defense classes, and you would have trauma-informed services, and all of this in one place. So we developed a direct service report that highlights the best practices for these issues, for working with this population. And we've been working with survivors to go meet with the representatives to start advocating for the creation of these services in Chicago. Unfortunately, right now, the pension reform is kind of the only thing people are seeing, which is important too, but we're hoping eventually that this will be more on people's radar and of importance.
Well, I've got my final question, and so I'll start with you just to prepare, and we'll work our way back around this way. So from each of your own perspectives, what has been the most successful or promising strategy coming from your organization, and what can be done here for, anyone here in the audience? Because I wrote a blog post about this, and the response I got was, wow, I didn't realize it was happening in my neighborhood. What can I do? So Gregory, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the best strategy is awareness. So everybody is aware of, number one, it's in their community. Number two, where to get help. Help for the victims. That's the most important, to save our children. Children are most impressionable and the most protected in our society. They shouldn't be victims in the first place. But how can we rescue and recover those? Those are probably the most important things that we could do is to the public, is provide, this is the phone number you call. If you suspect anything, help the children. We got to protect our children. They are our future. So education for me, prevention is also very important. And I think that's the key to the whole thing, is prevention. Get them before they get involved in it, and to get the community involved, because the community's out there. They live, you guys see things, your next door neighbors, what's going on, and then the other thing that's important is who to call. What to do with that information is always important.
I just want to say on the awareness thing, has anyone seen the Ugly Truth campaign downtown? The posters say on the trash cans that say human beings are not disposable, or so we just launched that with the Voices and Faces project. So we're just really proud of that. So if you see that, like, point it out to someone and be like, hey, did you know that this is going on? And I just went to this great lecture, and let's talk about it. So it's a good conversation starter. In terms of what's most effective, we are a demand-focused organization, so anything that makes it less safe to purchase sex in the second city, in Chicago, second city is part of the ad campaign, in the Windy City is a positive thing, because it's going to reduce the incentive for pimps and traffickers to identify victims. Johns respond to law enforcement. Really, thank you for what you do, because they say, if I'm arrested, I'm done. And so the more we put pressure on them, the more that it becomes socially unacceptable to purchase sex, and that we don't just say, oh, we're not going to hold these people accountable. We're not going to give Elliot Spitzer a CNN show because, we're not going to say that that's okay, this behavior. We're going to shift public attitude. So I think shifting public attitude and actually holding perpetrators accountable. In terms of what you can do, this is one of my favorite questions, because I think it's so important that we all have tools to make change. So three things that I'll say on that. Join our End Demand Illinois campaign. I promise you we will not email you more than once a month, so it's not overwhelming. But the truth is, Illinois is leading the country in terms of progressive legislation, and that's because people are picking up their phones and calling their representatives, and they're putting pressure on the representatives to do the right thing. Number two, we used to get asked this question a lot when CAASE started, and it was frustrating because we didn't have a good answer. And so we decided to develop a variety of toolkits to help people in their own activism. So if you are part of a faith community, we have Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and Muslim toolkits that you can download. All of this is for free on our website. If you are a parent with a high school age son, we have a toolkit for you. If you are a massage therapist and are sick of getting calls from potential Johns saying, hey, do you give extra services? We have an entire campaign for massage therapists. So all of this is on our website. The third and final thing I'll say is that our prevention curriculum is really changing young men's attitudes about this issue, that they just don't know, they're not hearing another voice. And the only way we get into high schools in Chicago is by having someone help us open a door. Because cold calling a principal and saying I'd like to come in and talk about pimping and prostitution doesn't usually get a return phone call, as you can imagine. So if anyone here is connected to a high school, please come and talk to me, because that's the best way we expand our programming.
The things that have been most effective for us is really around our training, technical assistance, and capacity building. And in particular, getting folks from different disciplines in the same room. So when we train law enforcement, we also bring social service providers in. There is often a big divide between social service providers and law enforcement. Law enforcement sees social service providers as, lefty, liberal softies, and then, social workers see law enforcement as these tough, people that are abusing children, right? So by bringing everyone together and having the training together and doing activities and having them pre-planned for when they do identify a victim has been very, very useful and very impactful. We've done this around the state of Illinois, around the country, as well as internationally. And it's really getting these people together, again, to demonstrate that it's not just a law problem, it's not just a law enforcement problem, it's not just a social service problem. So that has been really effective. You have got plenty of things on your website to sort of become an activist in this area. One thing that we're working on is a campaign called Human Trafficking is Our Problem campaign, right? So this is a way to sort of communicate that it's not something that just happens in Cambodia and Thailand. Yes, it does, but it's something that happens here in Chicago and around the world. So what we're asking is people to go to our blog and download a sign that says Human Trafficking is Our Problem. And we've made a video so far of the hundreds of entries that we've received, and we're also making a big photo quilt, and we're going to be advocating and using it as a public awareness piece throughout 2013. So I'll have information about where our blog and website is and how you can just easily download this sign, take a picture of yourself, and become part of this process. I think we need to start looking at that as a preventative measure as kids grow older, so they're able to recognize it. You know, underneath all that are those issues of poverty and family displacement and all those other things that go on that contribute to individuals finding themselves in this situation. So I think it's not just going to be a silver bullet where we can, like, you know, take care of it. It's all these other issues around it that create this environment that's ripe for this type of crime.
Well, what do we do on the abuse and neglect of the child, the children that are, I mean, you know, like Chicago Children's Advocacy,
yeah.
Those 2,500 cases a year,
yeah.
We know it's way more.
Yeah, and one of our projects is working with the Department of Children and Family Services to help update their policies and procedures and their clinical response to these children. It's different than familial abuse. The response has to be different. So we actually are replicating this project in New York as well. So Illinois and New York are one of the few states that are actually preparing themselves internally to be able to better serve these victims. So as the guardians, you know, of children who are at greatest risk, we're trying to build their capacity to be able to respond effectively and keep these kids safe.
Right here.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for your proactive work in making a change in legislation. It's really important because once that happens, people start recognizing it. Shelby, you mentioned labor trafficking, and I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more about that, because the whole concept of slavery, we don't realize that slavery exists in the
right.
21st century, and
right.
We can relate to the human trafficking of sex trade, but the fact of the matter is there's so much labor trade that is going on, and so many young people as well that are being abused. So if you could address that, and you could also talk about the societal issue, because when Greg said it's a problem with society, we've got groups of these young people who are leaving home, and we have them running away from home for various reasons. Mm-hmm. Some of them have to do with the fact that they are homosexual, mm-hmm. and they are in their ethnic communities not accepted, and so they get kicked out for doing one bad act, or bad act in the parent's mind, mm-hmm. or something of that nature, and there's not the social network and fabric to keep them from falling through the cracks. Groups like the Center on Halsted Street, mm-hmm. who are doing active programming, and other groups like that are there, but we need more. And we're losing our homeless beds. You say there are 8 beds for sex workers.
Girls only, yeah.
Yeah, but we're losing beds in Illinois for mm-hmm. homeless, and so children who are homeless, what happens to them?
Right.
So lots of questions in one.
Let me go from this one to the first one just real quick and jump in. So in regards to, I think what you're asking, sort of how do we prepare to better sort of address these victims. We right now, we facilitate, IOFA facilitates the Cook County Human Trafficking Task Force. So this is a multidisciplinary task force that comes together to help identify and prosecute cases. So it's social service providers, law enforcement, and all that. And we have subcommittees that work on various issues. We have an LGBTQ subcommittee. Center for Halsted is on our task force and are helping us train their staff to be able to identify victims, to know what trafficking looks like. We're working with homeless youth organizations so they know what trafficking looks like and where to go and where to get assistance. We have another victim services committee, and actually in the next couple of months we're going to be having a housing summit where we're going to be bringing together and we're basically service mapping right now the area to see what housing is out there already, who could be trained to possibly take on trafficking victims of all types, so both labor and sex trafficking, and then where is the gap and how can we all together work as a community to help fill that gap. So that's going to be coming up in the next couple of months. In relation to labor trafficking, and again, like I mentioned, it often gets mixed up with illegal immigration, but then you don't necessarily have to have legal status to be considered a victim because no one can consent to being a slave. I think one of the types of labor trafficking I've dealt with the most have been domestic servitude. So these have been, nannies, care providers for the elderly. Many of them coming with, with doctors, with diplomats from overseas coming from their country and ending up being enslaved. And so for the community, it's always good to have an eye out. And most of the domestic servitude victims that I've worked with have been identified by a good Samaritan or a neighbor who kind of said, you know what, that person is always at work. Never see them out on their own. They always seem to be working. They live in the basement and things like that. Also in relation to labor trafficking, there's several red flags that everyone can look for. So if you go to a restaurant and you see the same people there all the time, and in particular if you maybe look in the back and you see that there's beds, if you see somebody sleeping at the place where they work, that is a huge red flag that there's something going on. So I think it's really, since we don't have as much information about labor trafficking as we do about sex trafficking, I think it's up to all of us to start taking a look at the businesses we frequent to see kind of what's going on. And there's this campaign that we used to be a part of called Look Beneath the Surface, and it was through the Illinois Rescue and Restore Coalition. And basically it said, take a look. If you see a young person living in a house and they never seem to go to school, right? They don't seem to be living with family or relatives. If you go to your favorite restaurant and you see the manager somewhat intimidating, one of the employees, you start putting things together and just, kind of keeping an eye out. So I don't know if that answers your question about labor trafficking, but there's a lot to do on that issue, and we advocate heavily for us to learn more about that.
And just kind of a story, personal stories. I was doing a Rescue and Restore outreach day, and I went to where I bring my car to get washed. I'm like, hi, I'm here to talk about human trafficking, and the guy just looks down. And I was like, oh my goodness, like what's going on here where I bring my car every couple months, and something's not right. And one thing I will say is there's a great resource called the National Human Trafficking Resource Hotline. And if you have your phones out, it's really easy. It's just 888-3737-888. And I really recommend that you call that number if you see something that doesn't sit right with you, because these are people who are trained and work with law enforcement that have this background, that have an awareness. And so that's where I would first go if you think something doesn't feel right.
And if there's not enough evidence for them to sort of carry through, at least they're registering that somewhere in this area there was some concerns. And as more red flags are collected, there'll be more information for an investigation to be initiated. So.
I'm very concerned about children. I work a lot with children in my county. And I'm just wondering how much of the breakdown in our foster care program, particularly in Cook County, may be contributing to some of these kids ending up as victims or prostitutes, particularly the adolescents when they reach 18. I know there was a problem at one time where the foster parents would just open the door and they had no place to go. Has our Department of Family and Children's Services addressed that particular issue? And also, can there be more of a dialogue as these kids are starting to reach that age? Or, I know it's a sensitive issue, but still, I think that if maybe they know there are alternatives, that perhaps maybe, because to me that just seems like a ready market for these pimps to really prey on, knowing that these kids are in foster care, they're either being mistreated or they're going to be just arbitrarily pushed out on the street.
Traffickers target the most vulnerable, and in our work with DCFS, we have discovered that traffickers are targeting foster care homes. You know, they are there. We found this internationally as well in orphanages and other types of institutionalized care, because these kids don't have a familial network. They're often ostracized by society. What we're doing is trying to, with DCFS, is create as part of the foster care parent curriculum, is to include signs of trafficking. And to really identify it as a huge vulnerability for the kids whose care they're in charge of. So like anything else that they're trying to prepare to be the best foster care parent possible, putting this into that curriculum so they understand the language, they understand the signs, and there's an immediate process by which they can respond. So we are helping DCFS, and this is kind of just all bureaucratic stuff, but update their policies and procedures to know what to do from the hotline through investigation to clinical response once a victim is identified. Not only for the new ones that might be coming in, but for the kids who are already in their care. And arguably, and I don't have the numbers to back this up yet, but arguably the majority of kids who are being trafficked, who are working in the sex trade today, are actually already somewhat involved with the child welfare system in some way or another, right? So it's a really, if we really want to target the problem, I think we need to start there.
Thank you.
Question?
Sorry,
No,
my name is Pamela Rose. I'm the supervising judge of the Fairness Child Support Division for Brooklyn. And 35 years ago when I was in ASA, there were stings on Manheim. So what's the response of law enforcement, because it's been 35 years and it's still happening? And I'm sure the same motels are still there. So I know, and as the supervising judge, I see 15-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 12-year-olds who have children, and they are absolutely in the system, or they're not even on the grid. And I have my judges call the state's attorney's office for prosecution, and the response is, well, if the mother doesn't want to come in and testify, I'm not going to do it, okay? So what's the law enforcement response to putting an end to the Johns? I mean, you know, it's difficult. You know, or you go to another courthouse, and if it's the first offense, it's discharged. It's SOL, correct? So, do you have a plan?
Yeah, well, our main plan, of course, is, supply and demand. You got to go after the Johns. But more importantly, though, is to get that supply. That's what you got to do, is break that supply chain. It's so hard. A lot of the children that we see don't look like children. Why is that? Well, one of the things that's been scientifically studied is the growth hormones in food. So if you're looking now, women or children are having their puberty a lot earlier, many years earlier than they'd had in the past. They're developing a lot more. So when you look at a child, they may not look like our version of a child when we were young. It's like, you don't look like a child. So number one is you got to try to identify if they are a child. That's why I said it's so important, imperative that the community get involved. Well, they typically don't serve the community they live in. So they'll travel to other communities. So it's not as, oh yeah, I know so-and-so, I know how old that person is, and I see them on the streets. Sometimes that's the case, sometimes they travel. What law enforcement is doing, because the majority of the things we're seeing is those areas you kind of discussed, is a dramatic drop. Before, there were tons of people walking up and down the streets. Now it's not as prevalent. Now it's internet. I'd say 80%, I'd venture up to say 80% of the victims that are sex trafficked are on the internet right now. I mean, you just whip out your smartphone now, get on the internet, and you can see hundreds of women who are being prostituted. And we do conduct stings on a regular basis.
I did that, and luckily I used my computer in my chambers, and then of course the virus went on, and so then I had to have IT come in and take off the virus. But what I saw, and it was just chat rooms, was for teenagers, was beyond revolting.
And it's hard. We've been working with legislation, so we've met with senators, congressional leaders, but there's a fine line with First Amendment rights. They could advertise, and it's not against the law. So it's hard to shut down certain sites. Craigslist, it was totally voluntary. Now,
with a little pressure.
Yeah, with a little pressure, right. So they're putting on pressure on other websites. You have, congressional leaders from both houses drafting legislation. You have attorney general of multiple states that are sponsoring it, trying to put the pressure on, but the money is so great. I think there was a study, they're making anywhere from $16 to $19 million a year in profits in advertisement alone. And you can't really shut down First Amendment rights. They're saying we're an innocent third party. We're providing a service. They could sell a cup of coffee if they want, or whatever they want to sell. That's fine, because they don't go out and say we're selling prostitution. We're selling companionship. We're servicing massages, and that's how they're getting away with it. And the internet companies, we don't know what's going on. We can't screen every single person because there's too many of them. But it's kind of a losing battle, to be honest. Because I said a lot of it's society, because they're glorifying everything that's going on right now. And you've seen there's been big movements in the rap videos. Just how they talk to the women, refer to them as bitches, they refer to them as hoes, and this kind of the whole culture. And it's like, what is wrong with that? Well, it's accepted society, so now you have individuals taking advantage of it, and they're like, okay, it must be okay because I hear it. I see it on TV, and I guess it's okay. That's the norm. And it wasn't like that, and like I said, when we're growing up, it's a totally different world, unfortunately.
At least we didn't have the internet.
I want to say one thing though about Manheim Road, and I have a lot of Chicago pride, so I think we're doing a lot of good stuff. But Sheriff Tom Dart has been such an advocate on this issue, and he's been very vocal about this. Is not a victimless crime. There's a very clear victim, and that's the person who's being prostituted. And so he put billboards on Manheim Road that said, from your sheriff, you buy sex in this area, I'm going to come and arrest you. This is not okay. And so we've seen men start to move away from Manhattan. They talk about it on these websites saying it's not safe anymore. So we see that when law enforcement steps up, they shift, and what we want to see more of is a coordinated response so it just doesn't get displaced to another neighborhood. So that's what we want to see, be able to see that this is working, let's all step up and take these models and do them.
And would anyone like to comment on the notion, I don't know if this paradigm or this idea has changed, that it's the women's choice. It's a job and it pays. Does anyone want to talk about that? I'm sure.
I'll share my favorite quote.
All right.
For those of you, some of you know Catherine McKinnon, who is an amazing feminist lawyer and theorist, and she said, "Why do we talk about choice when it's those with the fewest choices who are most often found in prostitution?" And I think that just, to me, sums up all of it.
I think we focus on adolescents, and we feel that no minor should be can be involved in the sex industry in any way. However, there are sort of sex worker rights agencies and groups, and we spoke with them and whatnot. And there's a whole lot of socioeconomic differentiation across the spectrum of sex work, and I think there's maybe some who do have a choice, and there may be sort of an environment. I'm from San Francisco, sort of an everything goes kind of thing, and you always knew somebody who worked in the sex trade in some way or another, right? But then there's communities where the choice becomes so gray. You have if you're a 17-year-old and you've got to take care of your 13-year-old and 6-year-old sisters, what choice do you have in making money if you're not allowed to work or you can't find a job? So it becomes very, very complicated. I'm actually hoping that both sides at some point can come together, because I think that there's an interest. No one should be enslaved. No one should be coerced, manipulated into doing something that is psychologically and physically harmful to them. So I think there's a way to kind of create some unification in this dialogue, but there is a lot of, I think, conflict between the two sides. I see the commonalities that we all don't want people, women, men, children, to be involved in something that is detrimental, harmful, ultimately to them.
Yeah, the commercial sex trafficker uses that all the time when they recruit children. You're going to have sex anyway, you may as well get paid for it. So that's a common thing that they're doing, because it's, like I said, it's more socially acceptable now to have promiscuous sex out there at a younger age. So we see stuff like that. So you don't have an option. They're just trying to manipulate the minds, and they're the best, better than any psychologist or psychiatrist I've seen. They could really manipulate the kids. It's unbelievable.
And they don't go after the popular kids. You know, they don't go after the ones who have a strong sense of self. I mean, they see those kids sitting by themselves at the mall or at the bus stop who seem sad and depressed, who are not getting the attention that they need at home for whatever reason. That's who they're going after, because that's your best bet.
Right. And the closest, you know, what we've seen is runaways, throwaways, disposable kids. Those are probably 90% of the victim children that we see. Society kind of doesn't care. So runaways, we know runaway. Disposable kid, what's a disposable kid? Is parents don't care, or family doesn't care, or foster family doesn't care if they come or go. They're here, you come when you want, you don't. If you're missing, they don't report you're missing. So those are kind of the disposable kids. So those are the primary ones that we deal with.
Just on labor trafficking as well. Labor traffickers, whether it's a corporation, whether it's a subcontractor, they're going to focus on the lowest wage labor, right? Because they're going to be able to make the most from people who need work no matter what. Mm-hmm. So in the same sense, it's our most vulnerable for both sex and labor trafficking that we need to give attention to.
And the lovely pink sweater.
You mentioned the commonality of things, and you just mentioned disposable. And as sad as it is, we are a disposable society. We buy throwaway packaging, we throw away our children, we throw away our elders, we throw away the sick. There's a whole counterculture out there of taking care of disposables, and it makes money. So I don't think it's not just the human trafficking that needs to be attacked. There's a common culture here, and we are a disposable society. I don't know how that gets addressed. Do you attack it one thing at a time, such as human trafficking, one thing at a time, such as elder care? It's so common in everything we do. It permeates our society. How do you change that?
We have this conversation every semester in our child trafficking class, because our students start breaking it down, and we go further and further out, and we realize all the contributing factors to this particular problem. I believe in alliances. I think even though we're working on human trafficking, I want to align with those organizations that are working on poverty, who are working on better care in our mental health system for our elderly. You know, we might not be working on the same mission, but we certainly can have the same vision to sort of decrease that, you know, where we're disposing of humans like they are packaging, as you mentioned. So I think it's complicated, it's comprehensive. I think we're still evolving on these issues, but I do strongly believe in alliances, and the more of us that recognize these connections, the more we'll be able to create change on a much larger level.
Jack?
There's an interesting program on MSNBC called Dateline. You probably watched it, where they capture and trap these guys. Oh. That's aside. There seems to be one area that, and it's not from my own experience, but 35, 40 years ago, I used to go to Las Vegas, and when you walked in, you asked the bell captain for what you wanted. Mm-hmm. When Las Vegas got a lot more cleaned up, the hotels know who's coming in and who's going. Mm-hmm. If there was something that went against these motels, like if we catch it again, or if we do these things, we're closing you. The building department closes everything. They can do whatever they want. If there was a synergy between the law and the hotels or motels, along with a little rider when the guy signs in, that if we catch you doing prostitution, we will charge this MasterCard or Visa $1,000. Let me tell you, it's going to stop. Because Las Vegas now is absolutely, you have, between the time you hit the front door to the time you get to the elevator, there are 3 or 4 people who are watching every woman who walks into every single hotel. Mm-hmm. And if you get it, if they don't have a place to go, you're going to cut it down tremendously.
And if there wasn't men in Vegas purchasing, you would cut it down tremendously too. And I think what Shelby was saying about alliances, we see some great work with hotels, like Star Alliance Hotel, who are standing up and saying, not in our hotels, we're training our staff what to look for, we're making zero tolerance policies. So I think that this really highlights and demonstrates how important that everyone has a role to play in this, and hotels absolutely do as well.
And in the city of Chicago, right here downtown, we meet monthly with the hotels.
Oh.
So it's an ongoing, you know,
but there has to
commitment.
Be some teeth.
Yeah.
They know that they are going to have some financial skin in the game. They're not going to
Yeah.
You don't want to jeopardize the bottom line.
There's two things that we're working on. One is with the Chicago Bar Association. They're helping us with our ATOP project, but they're also looking at sort of legislative and policy things that can be done. And one of those is to create sort of a network of hotels who can say that they're traffic free. So we're starting to talk. We'll probably talk to you about that, so that there's some sort of badge that says, you know, like we say, we have like we're environmentally aware. Well, let's you know talk about that for both labor and sex trafficking as well. Also, there's an organization called ECPAT, End Child Prostitution and Trafficking. I always forget the acronym, but it's called ECPAT, and they actually have a code of conduct for hotels that they advocate for. So anytime you go to a hotel, you can go to the ECPAT website, download a sheet, and say to the person that you're checking in with, I see that your hotel is not on the list adhering to a code of conduct in relation to sex trafficking of children. Would you please sign on? You can't believe how difficult that actually is, because they feel like if they're signing on, they're admitting that there's some sort of issue, right? So it's just going to take a lot more, I think, groundswell from the public to demand that when I go to a hotel that, make sure that there's, conservative water use. Well, I want to go to a hotel that's not going to be frequented by Johns and by prostitutes, and is not going to use traffic labor for their service industry as well.
We have time for one more.
I'm particularly interested in the hotel issue, and so I have a couple of questions. My first one would be, when you meet monthly with the hotels, could you talk a little bit about what you're discussing? Because, for instance, are you doing training for the housekeeping staff and the bell staff to be able? Has that become common at the downtown hotels and at the hotels at the airport? And with regard to what you're talking about the EPIC code of conduct, what you said just now is very germane about how, well, if we sign on, are we admitting that we had a problem or might have a problem or used to have a problem? So, and what is going on to try to overcome that impression so that they do sign on? Do you want to go?
Yeah. The hotels downtown Chicago, this is the main focus we've been dealing with. They've been extremely helpful. A lot of the people that we do meet is the security staff. So typically heads of security for the major hotels, and you can, around here. And a lot of them are retired police officers. So we have a great working relationship. So when we meet with them, we tell them, okay, this is what we're looking at. These are the trends that we're seeing. In fact, they're very, very helpful when we conduct our stings. Either we're trying to rescue victims, or we're doing the John stings. They're very helpful with us. They give us, certain setups that we require to do law enforcement activity. Sort of very helpful in that. So we haven't educated housekeeping. It's just at the security level. I don't know, housekeeping. We're looking at security because they're the ones that are watching who's coming and going. They're the ones. Sometimes they'll call us. There's a tip. Hey, this is what we have going on. In fact, I know with Chicago Police Department, who's a member of our task force. This how dedicated Chicago police are. They gave us one of their whole vice teams, and they said, okay, we're going to have you guys committed to fighting juvenile prostitution. So they roll them to our task force. So we have a whole team. That's all we do. Every day that we work, we focus on juvenile prostitution. There was a problem, so we said, okay, we could take our team, help out. What are you looking at? There was a team of males who were dressed up as females, robbing individuals, robbing the Johns. So we got a sting operation, got those individuals. I mean, so we have had successes with their security people. But not too many people are willing to admit, I just got ripped off because number one, they shouldn't have been ordering up, a girl who's prostituted, and number two, now you're getting robbed. So it's very hard for them to come forward. But they came forward, and we were able to work with security because, like I said, they see who's coming and going. They said, okay, these are the suspicious characters that we observed. Okay, it makes sense. They looked at the video, and we got the individuals on video and had them come to meet us, and that's how we were able to capture them. So I mean, the security staff is extremely helpful. Are we going to get our biggest bang for the education? We're just looking at child prostitution. We're not looking at the forced labor. So we're not focusing in housekeeping.
No, I'm talking about housekeeping and also room service. So if they're ordering lots of extra towels, or if they're ordering ice cream and alcohol from room service, I mean, sometimes there's clues like that.
I mean, unfortunately, typically we see they're not spending that much time with the victims, that they're ordering up all that stuff. It's from our experience. I mean, I'm sure it happens, maybe, you know, on the higher end, maybe some of the adult professional escorts, but for the children, it's a real quick operation. I mean, you're talking less than an hour, if that.
Okay, so the children are not being brought in and brought into a room, and their customers are coming in.
Sometimes that is the case. You'll have the you'll have the commercial sex trafficker. They'll go and order 5 rooms, and they'll have 5 different victims work in those rooms, or 4, and he'll have the one. And as soon as they're done, I want my money right now. You can't hold on to it. And typically they take everything. Very few times, you know, here's $2. And when I say, you know, so talking to us, let me know. But you know, the runaway, throwaway, disposable children, they really don't have too much. They have really, you know, they've been picked on in school, made fun out of, and you have a sex trafficker who just drives up in a nice car and says, "Hi, how are you doing? Wow, nobody's ever talked to me like that. You're pretty. Come on in." And when I said, you know, then they take them to a fancy restaurant. You know, let's go to Denny's. You know, for them, because you're looking at the environment. That could be, you know, for certain individuals, hey, wow, that's nice. You know, when they're used to eating out of garbage cans, you know, that's not, you know, just going to McDonald's. That's typically what we're seeing when a sex trafficker, when they take them out to a nice place. It's a fast food place. And then they're welcoming it. And somebody's just giving attention and affection. So yeah, we do see that where they have multiple victims in big hotel rooms, and the individual rents it in his name, or they have the victims rent it in their name. I mean, it's all kinds of, I know this is going to be on the internet, so I'm not going to give away too much, because what we don't want to do is educate the commercial sex traffickers. Or we don't want individuals to, you know, the name location, so the public could go over there. I want to see what it looks like to see these people walking up and down the street, or the curious who wants to, you know, maybe engage in that type of activity. So that's why, I'm sorry for this presentation, it's kind of generic, because I'm very cautious, because we don't want to create, we want to create the attention, but not so much attention that the people are out there looking and getting involved themselves.
One more point, we have 15,000 homeless kids in the Chicago public school system. And when we think about it, those are the ones that you're talking about, especially that are just human parade. So.
Yeah, we have been in schools in Inglewood and in the grammar schools, as I said, and it breaks my heart when you go to the grammar school. We went to name the grammar school in Inglewood, you know, where you see the 12 and 13-year-olds, and you say, "Do you know what a prostitute is?" And they all raise their hand. "Do you know who they are?" And they all raise their hand. And what's the youngest girl? "Oh, I know, that's so and so, and she's such and such age." It just breaks your heart. Yeah, and because they know, they see it every day when they walk to and from school, and it just breaks you down. It's like at that age, you should not know any of that stuff. I'm sorry.
Is CPS involved with the work that you all are doing, Rachel? Because that avenue of using the homeless children avenue combined with an entryway through CPS might be the best way into every school that you can get into, with a program that says, if you're homeless, these are the things.
We just had our first meeting with CPS for that very reason, so to be continued.
We actually trained 400 school social workers who are really kind of, they get the most into their lives, and I've received several calls and have been providing assistance to cases as they're coming up.
That's all we have time for, but let's thank our speakers.
Well, I learned a lot today. I thought this was an informative program. I think it's here to educate people and really a call to action from what we heard, and hopefully we'll see positive results from this forum that we had here today. I thought everything I heard today was proactive. The speakers were all very good. It analyzed a problem that started off from the inception to how the problem has manifested itself in our communities and what should be done with it. And I think overall it gave a good synopsis in the brief period of time on what we as members of the community and political leaders should be doing. Well, I'm definitely going to raise the issue and try to educate people, colleagues in the City Council, members in my community, to the problems and pitfalls of and really what happens with human trafficking in our communities and globally.
I am so glad the Niagara Foundation is putting this on its agenda. I think as I do more of these public awareness sessions, people are coming more and more with a basic understanding and asking some really much more complex questions like, what do we do? How do we get to the bottom of this? Where before it was, kind of, oh, I didn't even know this was an issue. Now people come, they know it's an issue, and they want to be involved. And we're really glad that we can communicate with audiences like this to come up with strategies for the general public, for foundations, for other agencies, and first responders to be involved with the issue.
Very important to include the community. Everybody involved has a piece of the puzzle, and we have to work together in order to combat this problem.
I think what was really productive was to help people see the issue from multiple perspectives. So I think Niagara Foundation did a great job bringing together a very varied panel so that we could all use our expertise to leverage each other's knowledge. So I think it was very comprehensive in that way.